Gentlemen, it is my pleasure to invite to the stage Bishop Robert Barron.
Thank you all. Thank you, everybody. Well, we filled the room, didn't we? Pretty good. No, congratulations to all the organizers of this great event. You know, we started it last year and it was very successful, but now even more so this year. So I love the fact that we're building momentum. It's just good for us Catholics to get together. It lifts us up. And I'm especially glad that we have this topic that we have for the conference, namely beauty. Most of my life, I've been focused on the Word. As a student, as a teacher, as a writer, as an evangelist, a lot of my life's been about the spoken word, the written word. And the Catholic tradition reverences the Word, obviously, the Word of God, and the words of all the great thinkers and poets and theologians and all of that. But we also have reverenced the beautiful. And the beautiful is a means of evangelization. I think it's very important that we claim that part of our tradition. I've railed against, as you know, a dumbed-down Catholicism. I hate it because we're a smart religion, and we dumbed ourselves down. No one told us we had to do it, but we did it, and it's been a pastoral disaster. But we also uglified our tradition. We dropped a lot of the beauty of our tradition and decided somehow that, just flattening things out would be more appealing. Well, on the contrary, we should reclaim the beauty of our tradition. So delighted that that's our topic for today. Can I start? I think Devin is running the slides here. I'd be hopeless. I've tried to do this before. I give a talk, and there we go. He knows how to do it. I'm beginning with this figure depicted appropriately on an icon. That's St. John of Damascus, also called St. John Damascene sometimes. If you read Thomas Aquinas, he cites him all the time. Very pivotal figure, even though not all that well known. Born around the year 675, dies around the year 750 AD. So he spans the 7th and 8th centuries. Well-educated Syrian monk, most famous for his role in the iconoclast controversy. Maybe a little known, but it's a very important moment in the history of the church. The iconoclasts, of course, were those who wanted to break icons, to destroy icons. And they had a certain biblical warrant, don't make graven images, and it was seen as quasi-idolatrous. Keep in mind, too, that right around the time of John of Damascus, Islam is emerging, and Islam has got a very sort of anti-imagery tradition. So the iconoclasts emerged, but they were countered by the iconophiles, those who loved icons, and John of Damascus was their best advocate. Thank God he won, because without John of Damascus, there'd be no Chartres Cathedral. Without John of Damascus, there'd be no Sistine Chapel. Without John of Damascus, there'd be no Sainte-Chapelle. There'd be no history of the visual within Catholicism. Mind you, too, move forward several centuries, namely the 16th century, the time of the Reformation, you've got another outbreak of iconoclasm. But a lot of people in this room, myself included, lived through a third, which is a period right after the Council, when there was also great destruction, I think, of the beauty of the church. I don't know if you know the work of Malcolm Miller. I think he's still alive. But for decades, he was the dean of tour guides at Chartres Cathedral. I used to take his tours all the time when I was a student in France. But I heard him one time, actually not in France, but in Chicago. He gave a talk. And he said, I reverence the principle, ecclesia semper reformanda, right? The church must always be reformed, and there's always, corruption that needs to be addressed, and all of that. But, he said, the clearest sign that a reform movement has gone bad is when people start destroying beautiful things. And that's always stayed in my mind as dead right. So I stand with the great Catholic tradition that goes back to John of Damascus that loves icons. Now, what was John's argument? It's very interesting, very simple. It was based on St. Paul. Paul refers to Jesus as the icon, in his Greek, the icon of the invisible God. So yes, God is beyond representation. Of course, God's beyond anything that we could create to depict him. Of course he is. However, in the incarnation, God made an icon of himself, namely in the humanity of Jesus. Therefore, it gives a warrant to Christian artists up and down the centuries to participate in this move as we continue the incarnational impulse. It was a good argument in the 8th century. It's still a good argument. If Christ is the icon of the invisible God, we can continue making icons as well. I think I'm a little reluctant to put him up here, but Woody Allen, there he is. The reason I chose that picture, that's my favorite Woody Allen movie. It's called Hannah and Her Sisters. Came out the year I was ordained, 1986. And remember in this film, Woody thinks he has a brain tumor, but then he doesn't, but it throws him into an existential crisis. Of course, no great surprise in Woody Allen movies. But then his character goes on this quest to find meaning, and he goes to church after church. And what that scene was he comes to a Catholic priest and says, I think I might want to become a Catholic. And the priest says, well, what attracted you to Catholicism? And he said, well, first of all, it's such a beautiful religion. And I remember thinking, even as I saw the movie 36 years ago, A, that's right, and B, notice the evangelical power of our beauty. So here in the movie is a religious seeker, and he wasn't attracted by arguments, first of all, wasn't attracted by the liturgy, first of all. He was attracted by the beauty of our tradition. I think it was right in his time. It's still right. If I can go from Woody Allen to another great Jewish figure, namely Cardinal Lustiger of Paris. I wonder how many remember him. Do you? Jean-Marie Lustiger. He was the Archbishop of Paris in the 80s and 90s of the last century. And he was the Archbishop when I was a student in Paris. I'm especially proud, by the way, that he signed my doctoral diploma because he was the Archbishop during that time. But Lustiger was a Jew. His given name was Aaron. And his parents died in the Shoah. And during that awful period, they sent this young kid to a Catholic family to protect him during the Nazi period. And while he's with this Catholic family, he began reading the Bible in its entirety, Old Testament and New. But what really moved him to convert to the Catholic faith was a journey to one of the Gothic churches. And this young Jewish kid walks into it wasn't one of the better known cathedrals, but a Gothic cathedral, and it converted him. Now, I mean, he was a man of words. In fact, one of my favorite memories of my Parisian years was going on Sunday night at 6:30 to Notre Dame in Paris, where Cardinal Lustiger, a master of the French language, would hold forth. The French don't hesitate, by the way, to give 30-minute homilies. Well, I didn't mind when he was preaching. So my point there is he was a man of words, but it was imagery, it was art, it was beauty that moved him to conversion. Another figure here, the great Paul Claudel, the French playwright, one of the greatest French playwrights of the 20th century. Claudel, like a lot of moderns, had kind of wandered away from the faith of his youth into sort of a vague agnosticism. But then one day he finds himself indeed in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Vespers was being sung. And he was looking up at the north rose window, in my judgment, the finest rose window in the world. And at that moment, his faith was awakened. At that moment, he came to believe. It wasn't words, wasn't arguments, it was beauty that converted him. Now look, I'm no Lustiger, I'm no Paul Claudel, but I had a similar experience. And I've written about it, maybe you've read in some of the things I've written. It happened to me June the 12th, 1989. It was the day I arrived in Paris to commence my doctoral studies. And in some ways, it was like the worst day of my life. If you've been through the experience of leaving home and starting something new, how difficult that is. But nothing's more difficult than leaving your country and leaving your own language behind. And I was in this house that French was the only language spoken. This is pre-cell phone. All I had in my wallet was in a little piece of paper, the address of the house. And I got there, I dropped my bags off. I was hungry, I was tired, I was jet lagged. But I knew where Notre Dame was from studying maps of Paris. And so I just made my way down the Boulevard Saint-Michel, and I came to the Ile de la Cité, and there was Notre Dame. I entered, I walked up the main aisle, and I came to the transept, and I turned left, and that's what I saw. That's the North Rose that converted Paul Claudel. Well, I stood there roughly where he stood. They have a marker on the ground there at Notre Dame. It's roughly where he stood. I didn't know Paul Claudel at the time, never even knew the name. But I stood there. Why don't we keep it up there? There we go. I don't know, 20 minutes, half hour. Despite the jet lag, despite everything, I stood there and stared at that window. And no kidding, I went back to that spot every single day. This would be June. I came home at Christmas time. Every single day, I came to that spot and stared at that window. What was going on? Well, in the course of the talk, I might be able to articulate some of it. I didn't know at the time. I just knew it had this sort of mesmeric impact on me. Now, it wasn't conversion. I was a young priest doing my doctoral studies, but it affected some alchemy in me. It did something to my mind and my heart and my soul. That's the power of the beautiful. And I want to, in the course of this talk, kind of explore that. I mean, one way to put it is the extraordinary harmony of that window was placing some kind of harmony in me. But we'll say much more about that. I want to cut to Pope Francis here next. When I was with the California bishops on my ad limina visit, right before COVID hit, we were all there, and we spent 3 hours with him. He just responds to any question you ask. And in the course of that, he said, if you want to know the key to my pontificate, it's Evangelii Gaudium, right? The joy of the gospel, his letter on evangelization. And he told us, this is the way when you're writing church documents you think, it's a combination of Evangelii Nunciandi of Paul VI and Gaudium et Spes, hence the Evangelii Gaudium. And he said, that's the key to everything that I do and say, is how to evangelize. Well, in that document, what do you find? You find his stress on what he called the via pulchritudinis, the way of beauty. Now, I'll say something about von Balthasar, who was a big influence on the young Bergoglio. And so I think that's where he got the stress on the beautiful. I think one place you see it with Francis is he's a master of the beautiful gesture, isn't he? From the time he was elected, we saw that. His outreach to, the profoundly deformed man is paying his own bill at the clergy hotel, and his public gestures, I think reminiscent of John Paul II. He had that gift too, didn't he? But the beautiful gesture, the beau geste, as the French say, as a way of evangelization. Now, here's the question as we continue this analysis. So you say, okay, I get it, John of Damascus and the beautiful, and it seems to be part of our tradition, and, Paul Claudel, and, okay, I get all that. But isn't it a little bit vague and ephemeral to talk about the beautiful? I mean, isn't that kind of subjective? Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and, who am I to tell you what's beautiful, et cetera, et cetera? Can we get a more substantive sense of it? And here I do want to draw attention to Hans Urs von Balthasar, the favorite theologian of both John Paul II and Benedict XVI. There he is with the two of them. That's good. Henri de Lubac, who was no slouch himself in this regard, referred to Balthasar as the most cultivated man in Europe. At pretty high praise. Looking across all of European culture, he thought Balthasar was the most cultivated person. Well, Balthasar, let me lay a little philosophy on you. Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, articulated the move from the true to the good to the beautiful. the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, the critique of judgment. He took the three transcendentals, so-called, in that order, from the true to the good to the beautiful. Balthasar very consciously turned that around. So he writes his Herrlichkeit, it means the glory of the Lord. His first move was the beautiful. His second move, he calls it the Theodramatik. That's the good. That's how does finite freedom relate to infinite freedom. And then finally, his third volume is called Theologik, which means theologic, the true. He moved from the beautiful to the good to the true. Now, you say, okay, that's a little bit of, philosophical arcana, but I think it's very important in our culture today. In our postmodern culture, a lot of people are uneasy with claims of truth, aren't they? Truth, your truth, my truth, but there's no real truth. Don't lay your, truth on me. Who are you to tell me what to think? Even more so, if we talk about the good. Here's how you should behave. Well, come on, don't lay your value trip on me. That's just a power move on your part. People are very suspicious of the true and the good. I think Balthasar's instinct was, especially in our world today, beginning with the beautiful is less threatening to people. Fewer hackles go up when you start with the beautiful because all you have to do is say, look, just look at this thing. Show someone the North Rose window. Bring them into Chartres Cathedral. Show them Dante's Divine Comedy. Just look at, is that a better way perhaps to evangelize, to begin with the beautiful and then to move toward the good and the true? I know a lot of Detroiters here, right? As you probably know, I've got a strong Detroit connection. As a little kid, I lived in Birmingham and Troy, and my first baseball team was the Tigers, and I was there for the 1968 World Series, right? So that's the first baseball team that I really have in my mind. And the first game that my father took me and my brother, who's here, there he is, the first game he took me to was in 1967 at the old Tiger Stadium. Some Detroiters remember that? The old Tiger Stadium. And I was 7 years old, and it's a long time ago, but I remember it vividly, coming up out of the kind of bowels of the stadium, and then you suddenly see the bright green, it was a night game, so the lights, the bright green field, and the Tigers with their white uniforms. And I didn't remember the details of the game, but I remember the experience of the game. Well, I started playing Little League right after that. It was the beauty of that experience. It was the beauty of the game that led me to want to play the game. I moved from the beautiful to the good, and then I played baseball for many years. I was pretty good as a kid. I played for many years. And having played, I then came to understand baseball from the inside, right? I understood the rules and why they existed, etc. From the beautiful to the good to the true. If you're teaching a kid baseball, I would suggest that's not a bad way to do it. What wouldn't you do if you're teaching a kid baseball? Brand new, never played before. All right, let's begin with the infield fly rule. Well, no, I mean, baseball people know the infield fly rule is cool. I'm glad there is an infield fly rule. It makes perfect sense, But you don't start with that. You'd start with, look at the field. You maybe would show them a professional game. Look at how that guy runs. Look at how he made that catch. Look at how that hitter gets the full extension through the ball, and you show them the game. And then chances are they're going to want to play the game. And then having played for a while, they're going to understand the truth of it from the inside. Well, can I suggest to you that might be a good way to think about evangelization? If we're evangelizing, how shouldn't we begin? With rules. Rules are great. I mean, precious things in life we surround by rules. Right? That's a basic thing. If something is worth nothing to us, we have no rules about it. Can I pick up that rock in the alley? Well, yeah, who cares? There's no rule about that. But, can I take the Mona Lisa off the wall, please, and bring it home? Well, no, if something is precious to us, we surround it with rules, right? So I get it. But beginning with how splendid something is, and then drawing someone into the playing of the game, then they get the truth, the rules from the inside. So that's, I think, might be a path evangelically. I'll just give you one more example. I think we got some pictures from Brideshead Revisited, which is, I think, there we go. I think the greatest Catholic novel of the 20th century. And I remember watching it as a young guy, that wonderful PBS series. There's the young, Jeremy Irons, right on the right, playing Charles Ryder, but Laurence Olivier's in that, and John Gielgud is the cream and Claire Bloom, these great Shakespearean actors are in it. And it's a beautiful representation of the novel. So get it. Revisit Brideshead Revisited maybe, but better yet, read the book. But the reason I bring it up is Brideshead, the manor house you can see there. Evelyn Waugh, the Catholic author of this novel, I think wants us to see that as the church. So Brideshead, the sense of the church as the virgin bride of Christ, Christ who's head of his bride, the church, all of that. So Brideshead is the church. What first attracts Charles there on the right? Charles is a cool agnostic as the story begins, like a lot of people today. What first attracts him is the beauty of Brideshead. So he's an artist, he's a painter, and he goes into that manor house and he's just overwhelmed by the architectural beauty, by the paintings within it. It's overwhelming to him. Then in the course of the novel, it's a complex story, but in the course of the novel, he begins to feel the moral demand that's coming from living in that house. And then finally, at the very end of the story, he comes to appreciate the truth that's embodied within the house. It's the journey into the church, beginning with the beautiful, leading to the good, and finally coming to the true. I think it's that same Balthazar rhythm, the reversal of our usual instinct, beginning with truth or with rules, maybe begin with the winsome attractiveness, the splendor of the church as a way in. I want to quote this lovely line. At one point, Charles is at the house, and Sebastian, his friend, who's a practicing Catholic, comes back from Mass. And Charles begins to ask him some curious questions about religion. And Sebastian's like, oh, come on, don't bore me. He doesn't want to talk about it. But Charles keeps pressing him. And Sebastian says how lovely the story of Christmas is. And Charles says, well, you can't believe something just because it's a lovely idea. And Sebastian says, but I do. That's how I believe. And it's sort of a tossed off line in the story, but it's very telling. That's how I believe. I'm drawn into the truth through the beautiful. Okay, so you're still with me and you're saying, all right, I get that, but I'm still struggling with what does it mean to call something beautiful? Is there something objective about it, or are we just still in kind of a subjective realm? Well, can I draw attention here to Dietrich von Hildebrand, who's one of the great, that's the very young von Hildebrand, one of the great Catholic philosophers of the 20th century. Both John Paul II and Benedict XVI were deeply enamored of his thought. And he makes a distinction that, by the way, Hildebrand, to his infinite credit, was one of Hitler's #1 enemies. So he was editing a journal in Austria during the 30s, and was a fiercely anti-Nazi. One of the people that saw very early on that there was something seriously the matter with Hitler and Nazism. So he was so outspoken that Hitler had him like on his enemies list, #1. And von Hildebrand barely got out of the country after the Anschluss and all that. Barely got out of the country, eventually ended up here and taught at Fordham in New York. I had the great privilege, I never, of course, met him, he died in the 70s, but I met a couple of his students who were deeply impacted by him and then had an impact on me. But here's a distinction he makes. It's very simple, but it's helpful, it's telling. Between what he calls the merely subjectively satisfying and the objectively valuable. Let me let that just sink in. So the merely subjectively satisfying and the objectively valuable. So what's that? His example he uses a lot is a baseless compliment is merely subjectively satisfying. So someone pays you a compliment, but you know it's false. You know that you don't deserve that compliment. It's subjectively satisfying. It might flatter you, but it has no objective value. Mine is, I'm a big fan of spaghetti and meatballs. I have the culinary taste of an 8-year-old, basically. It's really true. People say, you studied in France? Yeah, I know. I never liked French food that much. But anyway, I find it subjectively satisfying. That's my point. I find spaghetti meatballs subjectively satisfying. It would never occur to me in a million years to become an evangelist for spaghetti and meatballs. Like, I want all of you to be, of course not. I realize that's a subjective matter of my private taste, right? But the objectively valuable, and I trust now as I start describing this, you'll know what I'm talking about. When something's objectively valuable, it's not received by your subjectivity or corralled by your subjective expectations. Rather, it breaks through. It shatters your receptivity. It rearranges your subjectivity. It makes you think about the world in a different way. You're not corralling it, it's corralling you. You know what I'm talking about? I don't have a picture of her, but one of my heroes, Iris Murdoch, the wonderful Irish novelist and philosopher, she talked about the objectivity of the French language. And I get this, having studied languages. You know, you're studying a language and you're just struggling with it. Like, it doesn't make any sense, or I can't get my mind around that, or why do they say it that way? And I remember I had a professor years ago, and I said, well, that's just not logical. He said, c'est le français. It's French. French is not there to please you. That's the point. It's there in all of its objective integrity and beauty, and it's meant to rearrange you. My secretary in Santa Barbara, a good friend, Sylvia Morgan, and Sylvia's from Argentina. And so she was also a Spanish tutor for me. And anyone there's Spanish speakers here, but people have studied Spanish. The ser estar distinction is deeply annoying to Anglophones. You know what I mean? That's the verb to be. But there are two ways to do it in Spanish, and it's like massively confusing which one you should use. And so regularly with Sylvia, I would complain about that. I'd say, oh, for Pete's sake, why can't the King of Spain just come get a little committee together and say we're going to have it ser or a star? It's one of the two. And she'd always give me this look like, when are you going to grow up, And look, it's the Spanish language, pal. It's not there to satisfy you. There's something objectively integral about it. Or like if you will hear from Liz Lev about the Sistine Chapel. If you walked in the Sistine Chapel, looked up, and you said, I don't like it. Well, see, that's exactly the right reaction, because you're treating it as something that's either subjectively satisfying or not. Yeah, I'm not really into that. Well, see, that's a judgment on you, not on the Sistine ceiling, right? That's telling you that your subjectivity is off kilter. Or you listen to Beethoven's Seventh Symphony and you go like, it's all right. Well, that's just completely inappropriate. The objectively valuable changes you. Now, my example, to go from the Sistine Chapel and Beethoven to my rock and roll hero, Bob Dylan. Do we have Bob Dylan coming up? Yeah. Now I'm from his state, by the way, his home state of Minnesota. I visited Hibbing, his hometown, a couple months ago. The Minnesota people? God bless you. Anyway, Rolling Stone magazine, which I've been reading since I was 18, it's in decline now, I'll tell you the truth. It used to be much better, but they had a cover story many years ago, and it was, what's the first song that rocked your world? And they asked a group of rock stars themselves, name the first song that rocked your world. And it was a good question, and I got it right away what that meant. They did not ask, what's the first song you liked? What's the first song that rocked you, that changed you? Well, see, I knew exactly how I would answer that, because the first song I remember liking was Sugar, Sugar by the Archies. Do you remember? These are the old folks like me remember. You know, Sugar Sugar is a really catchy song, and if it comes on the radio today, I turn the radio up and listen to it. I like that song, but it didn't rock my world. You know, it's a silly little ditty. But the first song that rocked my world was Bob Dylan's "Like a Rolling Stone" that I listened to the first time probably when I was in college, and I listened to it over and over and over again. And it's, in one way, a simple song. It maybe 4 or 5 chords. It doesn't have a bridge. It's not like a complicated song. But it's a song that rearranged my consciousness. It rearranged my thinking. It made me look at life in a different way. Do you know Patti Smith, the rocker, had a very similar experience with that same song. She said she was in college. I don't know what age she was, but she heard it for the first time. And she said, she pulled over to the side of the road, got out of the car, sat on the curb, and just tried to take it in. Well, see, Sugar Sugar won't do that to you, but a song like a Rolling Stone will do that to you. See, and that's von Hildebrand's distinction, I think, between the subjectively satisfying and the objectively valuable. Can I suggest to you that the truly beautiful is like that? See, it's not superficial decoration. Oh, isn't that nice? What a nice song, or what a pretty picture, or oh, look at... No, the truly beautiful knocks you down. Baltzar says it elects you. First, it stops you. You know, we talk about aesthetic arrest. That's Patti Smith, by the way, getting out of the car and just sitting on the curb. That was aesthetic arrest. You're stopped by the beautiful. But then Baltzar says it elects you, it chooses you, and then it sends you. Like what I'm doing right now, many, many, many years later, I'm telling you about this experience of hearing that song. I was arrested, I was elected, I was sent on mission. That should start sounding familiar now with the one we think is the most beautiful imaginable, right? But we'll get there. Okay, let's go now from Balthasar to von Hildebrand, now to my intellectual hero, St. Thomas Aquinas, who says some very interesting things about the beautiful. His first is there he is, quod visum placet, in his very pithy Latin. The beautiful is quod visum placet, that which having been seen pleases. Cool, it's a cool definition, you know, pithy. That which having been seen pleases. Think of me at the North Rose window. Paul Claudel with the same window. That which having been seen pleases. But now, what are you seeing? What's the visum? And his famous answer, you see it up there in his Latin and in the English. The beautiful occurs, Thomas says, at the intersection of integritas, consonantia, and claritas. And I'm rendering them, that's James Joyce's rendering, by the way. Wholeness, harmony, and radiance. When those three things come together, we say, that's beautiful. So integritas means wholeness, that it hangs together as one. Do you know when something's kind of at war with itself, whether it's a painting or it's a golf swing? You know, why do we all have bad golf swings? You can tell in an instant when it's an amateur swing. In an instant you can tell. Because it's at war with itself. It's not about one thing. By the way, Kierkegaard, the philosopher, said a saint is someone whose life is about one thing. It's a wonderful definition. It has integritas. It holds together. Secondly, consonantia. That means all the elements that make it up are harmonious, consonare, to sound with. Think of our Sistine Chapel choir today. When you hear those many voices... the many voices blending clearly into one song, into one that had integritas, that had consonantia, right? Again, think of a golf swing, all the elements that make it up. And when you see like a Rory McIlroy or something like that swing, it's gorgeous to watch. And if you're a golfer, you're admiring, oh boy, hit that thing a mile. But the aesthetic quality, like a slow motion of a golf swing. There's hardly anything in sports more beautiful than a really well-executed, harmonious golf swing. It's got integritas consonantia. And then the final one, claritas. In some texts of Aquinas, indeed, he says claritas refers to brightness of color. And that's true. I think when something's really colorful and bright, it catches our eye and we find it pleasing. But, if that's the case, then most of Rembrandt's paintings wouldn't be beautiful, right? The things that are somber in color. So what Thomas usually means by claritas is not bright color. What he means is the radiance of form. It's when the form of something becomes radiant. When you say now that's a golf swing, that's what it's supposed to look like. That's it. It becomes radiant, it shines. When those three things come together, you have the beautiful. Now, I'm going to give another kind of silly example here. Do you remember do we have it? Yeah, there we go. Do you remember John Madden, the commentator? He just died, didn't he, John Madden? Or is he still alive? Anyway, for years and years, John Madden, he used to be the coach of the Oakland Raiders, right? And then he becomes a really popular football announcer. And Madden loved the tough, down in the trenches players. He didn't like the fancy schmancy wide receivers and quarterbacks. He liked the down in the front lines, the trenches. And so I was watching a game one time with him, and the play had ended, and the camera was kind of scanning the sidelines, and it caught, not this very guy, but a guy like that. It caught this guy, and he was standing like this, and he had the black stuff under his eyes, and his jersey was ripped, and his hair is all sweaty, and he's standing like this, and Madden goes, there's a beauty, And I remember thinking, I doubt had read a lot of Thomas Aquinas, but you got it, is what he saw in that player, integritas, like he was about one thing, he was about one thing. And then he looked at all the elements that made him up and found them harmonious. And then the form became radiant to him. Like, yeah, that's it. That's what a football player ought to look like. This occurred to me with Father Paul Murray here from the north of Ireland, and again with golf in mind. Any golf fans watch David Faherty, the commentator from Northern Ireland? Everything he says goes up at the end, And he was, this is a few years ago, he was commenting on a game, and Craig Stadler, do you remember that name? Called the Walrus, right? Because he was a big, heavy guy, and he had stringy hair and this big kind of walrus mustache. And, not someone you'd say is a classic, beauty, but he's striding across the green, and David Faherty goes, he's a thing of beauty. I think he was just playing ironically on integritas, consonantia, and claritas. See, think here too, everybody, beauty is subjective. No, it's not. It's as objective as the true and the good. If we're tempted to say, all value, moral value is just relative. No, it's not. The whole society falls apart if we hold that. Or you say, as people today sadly are saying, all truth is relative and culturally determined and just plays of power. Well, God help us. God help us, then we can't say anything true anymore. So just as the true and the good are objective, so is the beautiful objective. And God help us, the Catholic Church right now in the Western world is one of the last great defenders, I think, of the objectivity of the true and the good and the beautiful. So don't let them bully us. I mean, there's a bullying going on in the culture big time, and they're completely caught on the horns of a dilemma. Because the minute you say, hey, there is no objective truth, well, at least you think that's objectively true, don't you? So the whole thing is ridiculous, and we should stand with our great tradition. Okay, let's do a couple more things with you. So now we've been trying to fill out the picture of what makes the beautiful beautiful, but now I want to make this move toward the link between the particular beautiful thing and the source of beauty. And my first stopping point is with Plato and this marvelous dialogue, the Symposium, which we probably all read and Philosophy 101, this dialogue on the nature of love. But the most famous speech in it is given by a woman named Diotima. And she's talking about the progress by which we move from our appreciation of the particular beautiful toward the source of beauty itself. And I'm just going to read you some passages from her famous speech, just to give you the idea. She says, first of all, if his teacher instructs him as he should, he here is like a student, is somebody he's trying to train. He will fall in love with the beauty of one individual body. So it's someone falling in love with the beauty of one individual body. But then, next he must consider how nearly related the beauty of any one body is to the beauty of any other. And then he must grasp that the beauties of the body are as nothing compared to the beauties of the soul. So now we move from one level of beauty to another. And from this, he'll be led to contemplate the beauty of laws and institutions. So now we go beyond the human realm into this more abstract form of beauty. Next, his attention should be diverted from institutions to the sciences, so that he may know the beauty of every kind of knowledge. Here's that moment when, it's wonderful, when you begin to understand philosophy and history and science, and the beauty of these disciplines opens up to you. And finally, turning his eye toward the open sea of beauty, he will find in such contemplation the seed of the most fruitful discourse and the loftiest thought. So I'll just give you a couple little passages there from the Diotima speech. But look how it moves. From a very particular beautiful thing, then to ever wider horizons of the beautiful. Until, now watch this metaphor because it's going to be repeated a lot in the tradition. Turning his eyes toward the open sea of beauty. That means the infinite source of the beautiful itself. Did this speech have an impact on the Western tradition? Yeah, big time. And I'm going to give you just two famous examples of it. This Platonic move is mimicked many centuries later by the great Dante. With Aquinas, probably the great mastermind of our tradition. Dante, even though it's a little bit foggy how much is true and how much is poetic elaboration, but it seems pretty clear that when he was a very young kid, he spied this girl, just a year younger than he, named Beatrice, and he was immediately, absolutely, completely in love with her. 9 years went by without his really seeing or speaking to her. And then he has that famous experience crossing the Arno in Florence. He spies Beatrice, and this time she gazes at him and even exchanges a few words with him. But it's enough utterly to change his life. Her beauty was such that he began living a new life. And he writes this famous poem called La Vita Nuova, the new life that was opened up to him by this beautiful girl. And at the conclusion of that, he says, I will write a poem to her more beautiful than any poem ever written. Well, by God, he did. It's called the Divine Comedy, in which she plays a key role, Beatrice, right? Which is what? To lead him finally to the vision of God. Well, we go right from the Diotima speech of Plato right to Dante, and there's a straight line. Is this particular beautiful who leads him by steady steps to the beautiful itself, the source of beauty. I'll give you one more example. Now, fast forward almost to our own time. The great James Joyce. What can you say about James Joyce? It hasn't been said, but a Catholic in many ways to his bones, even though he repudiates the church and announces his hostility to it. But I don't think you can read anything of Joyce without seeing Catholicism all over the place. But one of the most famous examples is in his portrait of the artist as a young man, his autobiographical novel, when he was like around that age. It's about many things, that book, but there's a famous scene, and it reflects a real event in Joyce's life when he actually saw the woman who'd become his wife for the first time. But in light of everything I've been telling you, and I'm going to close with this, don't worry, I won't go on much longer. In light of everything I've been saying, see what's going on here. So Joyce is walking on the Strand, he always calls it, the beach in Dublin, and he's struggling, with what to do with his life and what's it all about, and he thought he might want to be a priest, but now that's over, and he's wondering what to do. And then suddenly this. A girl stood before him in midstream, alone and still, gazing out to sea. Joyce, who read everything, right away, we're thinking the Diotima speech is turning toward the open sea of the beautiful itself. So a girl stood before him, alone and still, gazing out to sea. She seemed like one whom magic had changed into the likeness of a strange and beautiful seabird. Her long, slender legs were delicate as a crane's and pure, save where an emerald trail of seaweed had fashioned itself as a sign upon the flesh. Her slate blue skirts were kilted boldly about her waist and dovetailed behind her. Her bosom was as a bird, soft and slight and soft as the breast of some dark plumaged dove. But her long, fair hair was girlish and touched with the wonder of mortal beauty, her face. Well, now notice something here, and Joyce is very clear about this earlier in the book. He's a student of scholastic philosophy, and he had spent time in this very book explaining integritas, consonantia, and claritas to one of his friends. Well, what do you see? A girl stood before him in midstream, alone and still, gazing out to sea. Integritas. He's isolated her. He's seen her as whole. And what I've read to you, it's a little bit of the passage, is the consonantia of all the elements that make up this beautiful girl. And then this. She was alone and still, gazing out to sea. So again, lest we miss the Diotima, he says it again. And when she felt his presence and the worship of his eyes, her eyes turned to him in quiet sufferance of his gaze, without shame or wantonness. This is beautiful. It's very much like von Hildebrand. Joyce distinguishes between the pornographic gaze, which is a gaze that wants to possess. It's the gaze that wants subjective satisfaction, as opposed to this gaze, which is a worshipful gaze. It doesn't want to dominate the one that's seen, but it is drawn by the power of what's seen into something greater. It's exactly this distinction. The first faint noise of gently moving water broke the silence, low and faint and whispering, faint as the bells of sleep, hither and thither, and a faint flame trembled on her cheek. And then here's how the passage ends. "O heavenly God," cried Stephen's soul in an outburst of joy. Well, see, that's how it works, isn't it? Is the beautiful particular leads by steady steps, if we allow its power to work on us, to the very source of beauty. In Joyce's example here, "O heavenly God," in a burst of joy. From Diotima through Dante to James Joyce, it's the same move. And I would argue that's a deeply Catholic instinct, that the particular beautiful window or cathedral or ceiling or painting or sculpture can lead us to this moment, "O heavenly God." Hey, Devin, can we just go, and I'll close with this, to the rose window again? I want to just meditate a bit more on that. Can we get the north rose up there again? At the very center of the rose, this is true of all the great roses, is always Christ. So you see it's his mother, it's Notre Dame Cathedral after all, but on her lap is the Christ child. Christ is the center. And then the window is organized in ordered harmonies around that center, and then all of it connected by spokes to the center. Well, can we show the big picture again, Devin? To get the whole thing. There we go. You see how the harmonic arrangement is such that all the parts relate to every other part, and all of them are drawn toward the center. Can you see, and by the way, this is being built right when Thomas Aquinas is in Paris writing about integritas, consonantia, and claritas. I can't help but think there's no better exemplification of it. The window is one, right? It hangs together as one. It has integritas, wholeness. And then the consonancia of the parts. And then if you want claritas, radiance, the light pouring through that window, the splendor of form, it's all there. But see, what that's meant to be is a picture of the well-ordered soul. If Christ is the center of your life, then all the elements that make you up will tend to find their place harmoniously around that center. So think of, the French call those medallions, each of the things. Think of all those as representative of parts of your life. It's your private life, your public life, your emotions, your intellect, your friendships, everything. Are they all connected to Christ? Then they will tend to fall into a harmonic relationship around him. Here's something else that you might not be able to see too clearly, but right around the central window, there are 8 little circles. You see them? Now go the next row out. It's twice 8, 16. Next row out, it's twice 16, 32. And then another row of 32. Add together 32, 32, 16, and 8, and you will get, I will tell you, 88. So the north rows is a meditation on the number 8, which stands for eternity, because it stands outside the 7, which is the completed cycle of time, the 7 days of the week. That's why we speak of the octave of Christmas or the octave of Easter, right? The eternal dimension. And then the spinning of the wheel, the circle, is evocative of a perfect shape. Therefore, it's a meditation on what your soul should look like. If it's centered on Christ, it'll be as beautiful as that. And it's also an anticipation of the, oh, heavenly God, how that beautiful thing leads you by steady steps to the very source of the beautiful that we'll look at forever in eternity. Isn't it wonderful, by the way, that the beatific vision is offered to us as the image of heaven? It's looking at something. Quod visum placet, that which having been seen pleases. Beautiful things here below ultimately are anticipations of the beauty we'll see forever in heaven. And that's why it matters so much.
I get to chair interesting conversations from week to week on a show called Unbelievable. And I've had both Bishop Barron and Tom in conversation with other dialogue partners, but it's a real pleasure to bring them together today. And we're going to be discussing the question, how can the church tell its story in a post-Christian world? And there will be opportunity for questions later on. So you're going to use the Slido app for that, I'm told. There's the hashtag there to be able to submit your questions for a bit later on. But please, again, give a warm welcome to my guests, Tom Holland and Bishop Barron. Well, what a delight to be able to bring you both together. I know there's been a lot of anticipation for this dialogue at the conference today. Let's start with you, Bishop Barron. Tell us, firstly, the fact that you're so influential in your ministry, Word on Fire, on YouTube, in online spaces. Where's that come from? What kind of fruit are you seeing through that?
Yeah, it's a question people ask me a lot, and I've reflected on it. I'm not sure I have a really good answer. When I started doing my work in this more kind of public evangelization, and I do YouTube videos and various things, all kinds of people said to me, oh, no, don't do it like that. You can't be sitting in front of a bookshelf and with your Roman collar on and talking in a serious way. No one's going to listen. And this is a true story. We had a kind of a PR fellow early on, and he said, Father, I'd recommend you should lose the collar and the bookcase and maybe come in on a skateboard. I'm not joking. And I mean, thank God I didn't do that. And they proved nevertheless to be popular. And I think it would be some combination of truth and beauty. I've been a passionate critic of the dumbed down Catholicism that I got as a kid. So my generation, I'm not sure it's true here, but it was in the States for sure. After the council, not because of the council, but after the council, we dumbed down the operation, and it was a pastoral disaster. A lot of people have disaffiliated because religion seems stupid, or it doesn't answer the challenge of science or the new atheists or whatever. So I tried to do it in a way that was smart, and then in my longer form work, like the Catholicism series, we really emphasize beauty. And my inspiration was your countryman. It was Kenneth Clark. I watched Civilization when I was a kid, and that changed my life. And I wanted to do something similar for Catholicism. So I would say some combination of truth and beauty is why it was popular.
Tom, your influence has also been felt in recent years, and you've been increasingly involved in the orbit of Christian conferences like this because of this interest that you've developed in the Christian story, history. You've obviously become massively well known also, not just through your written work, but through the podcast, The Rest is History, that you do with Dominic Sambrook. Tell us, though, for those who aren't familiar with your story, how this interest arose for you in telling Europe and the West its story again as regards Christian history.
Well, it actually goes all the way back to childhood, and I'm sure a groan will be going across the conference as I begin with that. But I do want to begin with that. So I was raised in the Church of England by my mother, who is still, an absolute example for me of moral behaviour. So I never had any issue with Christian ethics or teachings. But the truth was that although I was always very interested in the Bible, I much preferred the Greeks and the Romans. And even in the context of the Bible, I preferred Pharaoh. I preferred Pontius Pilate. I mean, it's a terrible kind of confession to make. And over the course of my teenage years, it was as though my faith started going down like a kind of dimmer switch. And when I kind of reached my 30s, I realized that actually what I wanted to do was to write history. I turned to the great dramas of Greek and Roman history and the great kind of figures of them, because that had what had most excited me as a child, the Spartans at Thermopylae, Caesar in Gaul, and so on. And I found over the process of writing those books, I found them more and more unsettling. Caesar, who slaughtered 1 million Gauls, Leonidas at Thermopylae, whose state was founded on systematic exploitation of a conquered Greek city. And so it troubled me how alien these people actually were in a way that I hadn't kind of faced up to as a child or up until my 30s, really. And so I started wondering, well, where do my values, where do my assumptions, where do my ethics come from? And began to realize that, of course, that it's Christianity. Christianity is the great revolutionary process that utterly transformed antiquity to the degree that most of us in the modern West don't even recognize that revolution ever happened. But I was thinking, because this is a Catholic conference, I was thinking specifically of my relationship to Catholicism, which was a very Protestant one, I now realize. To the degree that when I first went to Rome and I actually saw a cardinal, my assumption was that he was off to poison a nunnery. I'd read so much Jacobean tragedy that I'd obviously just kind of imbibed this. And I began to realize that, I realize now looking back that my kind of atheism was very Protestant. It was a kind of, and I think the fusion of kind of modern atheism with Protestant anti-Catholicism is very close, to the degree that I think that, atheism of the Dawkins kind, I mean, it's simply Protestantism that has reached a level where it doesn't believe in God, which I'm sure you as Catholics may feel is the inevitable endpoint of Protestantism. And I wouldn't disagree, actually. I wouldn't disagree. But there were two things, and I'm sorry, I'm hogging the conversation here, but I just want to say, there were two things that going into the 21st century changed my opinion on this. The first was precisely this issue of well, if everything has changed since the classical world into the present day, where did that, what is the process of change? Of course, it's the coming of Christianity. That's the primal revolution. But was there something distinctive about what happened in Latin Europe? And I fixed on the 11th century as being the crucial moment. And I came to see the medieval church, the Roman church of the High Middle Ages, not as the kind of hidebound reactionary institution that my Protestant upbringing had kind of instinctively led me to see it as being, but actually as being the primal revolutionary institution in Western history. That the revolution that was initiated by reformers, people who called it reformatio, a reformation in the 11th century, set the pattern for the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, for French Revolution, for whatever it is that we're going through at the moment. All of these, it's really the Catholic Church that blazed the path for that. So that was one perspective, and I wrote a book, Millennium, that kind of explored that idea in the first years of the first decade of the 21st century. At the same time, I had children, 2 daughters, who went to a Catholic school, Catholic primary school. And the reason for that was that my wife had been baptized Catholic, and her parents had then spectacularly lost their faith when they at her baptism, they had to confront the doctrine that she had been born with original sin. And they kind of lost their faith with a great whoosh and became militant atheists, and brought her up with an absolute ignorance, not just of the Catholic Church, but of Christianity generally. They were actively hostile to it. And then her mother died very horribly of Alzheimer's and cancer as our eldest daughter was being born, was in her first years. And Sadie went, I think, as a way of looking for some way to understand why and what was happening, went back to the Catholicism of her mother to try and understand what had made her mother what she was, and started going to the local church. And because of it, she then wanted our children to go to the local Catholic primary. I started going as well to the Catholic Church, and it was a revelation because it was a Jesuit church, and you can imagine how I viewed the Jesuits. Again, they'd offer me a cup of coffee after the mass. But they were wonderful. I mean, they were brilliant pastoral priests, but also wonderful teachers. And one of them, Damien Howard, is the head of the Jesuits now in Britain. So we were very honoured to kind of have them. And there was an absolutely wonderful priest, Father Tom Hennigan, whose memory I would like to pay tribute to here, who was, I think, the saintliest man I ever met. And that experience kind of radically changed my opinion, not just of Christianity, but of Catholicism specifically, and definitely informed my desire to then write Dominion and see if that what I'd explored in Millennium, this idea that the Catholic Church, I think it's wrong to call it the Catholic Church. I mean, it is Catholic, but the medieval church, the Latin church in the 11th century, going through the Middle Ages, was this revolutionary institution. Could I trace that insight back to the beginnings of Christianity, and could I trace it forwards through the Reformation and into modernity up to the present day? So I'm not just saying, well, I am saying that because it's a Catholic conference, but it's no less the truth.
It's been part of your journey
for that. Yeah.
And I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with Tom's story and the way that he, at an intellectual level, came to see the way that all of Western culture has been shaped by the Christian Revolution 2,000 years ago. Bishop Barron, what's your response though to Tom's own journey as well, as he's gone on that pilgrimage, as it were?
Well, I mean, I find it fascinating. There's different dimensions to it, some intellectual, but some more moral. I mean, it's the witness of great Christian saints that often makes a huge difference. Can I have my philosopher's hat on for a second? His comment about Protestantism, atheism, and so on is very interesting, because in the High Middle Ages, in the work of my intellectual hero, Thomas Aquinas, God is not a being. God is ipsum esse. God is the sheer act of to be itself. Now, what that means is God is not competing with us. So God's not one being among many. If God were just the supreme being, there's all of us and there's this big supreme being, God, then we're jostling for superiority on the same playing field. But God is ipsum esse, which means, and there's the burning bush example, right? As God comes close to us, we're not overwhelmed or destroyed, we're enhanced. But that got lost at a certain point philosophically. Think of the rise of nominalism and so on, where God is construed as a supreme being. But what happens is at first you'll be still piously related to that supreme being, but in time you'll begin to resent that supreme being. You'll see that supreme being as a threat to your freedom, a threat to your flourishing. And then at the end of the day, you might say, who needs him? We're doing fine without him. I think there is a trajectory from the loss of Aquinas's metaphysical view of God to atheism. So I think a recovery, I love the recovery of of the High Middle Ages, not just artistically giving rise to the Gothic cathedrals and Dante, but philosophically, it was the right understanding of God. Now press that all the way back, that Jesus is both divine and human. The two natures come together without mixing, mingling, or confusion in the unity of one person. Well, that's not possible if God were a being, right? That God and humanity would be at odds with each other, battling. The fact that we can say Jesus is truly divine and truly human, that's a distinctive view of God. And it makes possible a real humanism, total respect for human freedom, etc. So I would trace some of those links all the way back philosophically and theologically that undergird some of the historical realities, that Tom explores.
I mean, you yourself have obviously spoken at length and written at length, Tom, about the way that you see modern humanism, modern atheism, secularism as essentially an outgrowth of the Christian story. And to that extent, you've even described atheist secular humanism as a form of faith itself. Explain what you mean by that and why you think that actually it owes its roots in that sense to the Christian revolution.
Oh, goodness. How long have we got? So maybe I should just tease out what I think the kind of the evolutionary links between modern atheism and Protestantism are, because I think they are also, go back a very long way. The ambition of modern atheists is it's an evangelical one. They have good news to preach, and the good news is that if you overthrow the idols of superstition, if you banish superstition, if you bring people who have walked in darkness into light, then they will be better people. They will be morally better people. They will live better lives. And the link to the arguments made by the Protestant reformers there is very, very evident, because the Protestant reformers were saying exactly the same, that the world is mired in darkness and superstition, that there are idols everywhere, that you topple these idols, you pull down the rood screens, you paint over the idolatrous images in churches, you whitewash them, and so on, then people will be brought into light. But it's not like this is a completely radical break, because the missionaries in the early Middle Ages are preaching exactly the same. They are going into pagan shrines and chopping down trees that are identified with gods and all kinds of things. And this is exactly the language that they are using. And of course, the language that they are using in turn ultimately derives from the Hebrew prophets. This is language that Isaiah is using. The idea that the gods worshipped by the Babylonians or the Egyptians are mere stock and stone. And so in a sense, you could see the entire history of Christianity going back even before the birth of Christ as being an expression of the conviction that idolatry, once it is overthrown, will bring people into the light. And it's in that sense, I think, that contemporary atheism, wonderfully bearing in mind that Richard Dawkins is one of its chief evangelists, that is the course of evolution. That is where the evolution has led.
Any thoughts on that?
My thought is, in the Bible, the option is not, belief or unbelief. That's a modernism. The option is true belief or false belief, right? So people always have some relationship to a summum bonum, some highest good. We wouldn't get out of bed in the morning unless we did. Everyone has to have their values finally ordered in a hierarchy in relation to some highest value. Now, it might be, pleasure, money, power, your country, or something, but everyone's got some highest good that they worship. And the biblical option, go back to people like Isaiah and company, is say, well, no, stop doing false worship, do true worship. Then read Augustine's City of God, the same thing. He thought the Romans had a bad summum bonum. They were worshiping false gods, and I've got the true God to give you. And Augustine, to me, is very illuminating there, because he saw the Roman gods as violent and contentious and jealous and so on. And so we become what we worship. And that's a basic Augustinian principle. And that's true. You become conformed to what you think the summum bonum is. So if that's the highest good, you become conformed to it. Augustine proposed the God whose name is love. And so the nonviolence of God is very interesting to me in the City of God. It becomes very important. If I worship the God whose name is love, then the City of God will break out in relation to it. I think those are still very relevant categories for us. What's the highest good? What are we worshiping? If it's something like sex or pleasure or country or money or power, we're going to have a messed up society. If it's the God whose name is love, then we got a fighting chance. I think that's the central argument of the city of God. So I would see that as the biblical.
And in a post-Christian culture that we're now living in, how is that message landing? And why? What are you seeing in terms of the people you're reaching? Do you find that they are tiring of the secular version, even as it has been informed by the Christian tradition? Do you think they're looking for something different now?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't really target so much the young people, but a lot of, let's say, people in their 20s, 30s would watch the things that I do. And I think they know deep down there's something deeply off about the society. And if all we have is the buffer to self, to use Charles Taylor's language, but just this self that has no connection to the transcendent, is just the goods of this world, those are the highest goods, that we get messed up on the inside. So we have all the psychological and spiritual struggles, and then the society becomes skewed. And I think when religion is proposed in an intelligent, beautiful way, in a confident way, people respond to it. We became very apologetic. By we, I mean the Christians. We became very, I'm sorry, and I'll present my religion in a very superficial or domesticated way. I think when we do it boldly and confidently, the way Augustine did. Augustine said, we shouldn't worship the Roman gods. I've got the true God for you, whose name is love, who's revealed in the cross of this first century rabbi. To use Tom's language, the weirdness of Christianity, I think, is very attractive to people, but it's a weirdness from which a rightly ordered society comes.
Do you feel like your rapprochement with Christianity yourself, Tom, is that just an eccentric thing of your own, or do you see that as something that might be suggesting there's something going on in our culture that people aren't content any longer with the secular story?
Well, it's on two levels. The argument, maybe it's eccentric, but I think it is true. It seems to me patently true that we live in still a society that is utterly, utterly saturated with Christian assumptions, and that it has ceased to be Christian for utterly Christian reasons. That's the paradox of it. and why I think it's so hard for Christians actually now to make their case is that by and large the people they're opposing kind of agree with them, indeed have kind of made a massive land grab. So much of what made Christianity distinctive, from the perspective of the ancients, weird, is now taken for granted. And the state has nationalized so much that the church did, be it education or healthcare or concern for the weak and the poor and the suffering. So much of that has been appropriated by the state that, what is left for the church to do? It cannot. Well, often
that's the question then, I suppose, is our question before us is how can the church tell its story in a post-Christian world where, yet arguably, a lot of what it offered has been kind of, in a sense, taken on by the state. How do we make a distinctive story?
So for what it's worth. And I have, I'm not in any way really qualified to opine on this, but for what it's worth, my feeling is that what the church has to do is to major on what still makes it distinctive. And so I think there is a risk at the moment that churches try and accommodate themselves to the new kind of elite dispensation, rather in the way that people in England, say, did in the 16th century, that they started to accommodate themselves to Protestantism because it was Protestants who were now, leading the state, in the government, in universities, and so on. And so bit by bit, people just adjusted themselves to that as being the way that the country was organized. And I think that Christians likewise are now doing that to a fundamentally secular order and it's easy for them to accommodate to that secular order because that secular order in all its assumptions and values and ethics tends to be Christian. So you can do it. The risk with that is that you end up as Christian leaders or as the Christian laity becoming completely indistinguishable from the broader kind of secular bloc. Yeah. So I think the emphasis has to be firstly on reminding people that stuff that they take for granted is actually very odd. there are no human rights if you're an atheist. You know, where do they come from? They don't exist any more than angels exist if you're an atheist, if you don't believe in any of that stuff. Assumptions about how and why you should behave that clearly derive from Christianity. The assumption that we should care for the weak or the poor, that the weak or the poor have any inherent value. This is a Christian insight that our society in the West would not have were it not for Christianity. So to remind people, you think this is just natural, you think this is a given, you think this just rises, you know, it's a kind of default assumption. It isn't. It's something that you believe. You have beliefs just as much as Christians have beliefs. But I think also there's a need to emphasize what's the theme today? Telling the Christian story. The Christian story is amazing. And I think that the ball the churches have dropped, and I'm talking about England here, I don't know whether it's the same in America, is that they have allowed generations of children to grow up with an unfamiliarity with the most basic stories that I think have done more to structure how people in the West over the past 1,000 years and more have come to think than anything else, that more than catechisms, more than statements of principle. It's the stories, it's the idea, it's the story of the passion. It's the story of Christ's suffering and then his triumph over torture and death and horror that has made the Christian people what they are and the modern West what they are. It's the story of Exodus, the idea that slaves have been brought out of bondage and brought to a new land. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. You know, if people want to understand why there is the current debate about how we should treat refugees or how we should treat those who are less fortunate than us, the parable of the Good Samaritan has done more to hardwire that into the collective consciousness of the West, I think, than any number of kind of statements of principle from political parties or philosophers or whatever. It's that story at the most basic level. And that reflects the fact that the Jesus of the Gospels is the greatest short storyteller of all time. His stories have had a greater impact on the way that the world thinks than any other storyteller. And it seems to me lunacy that children can go to church schools and come out of it lacking a familiarity with the most basic parables. It seems insane.
I wonder if you want to pick up on that, because one thing I noticed you mentioned in your opening address was it's not necessarily about modernization of the church, and I think that's what a lot of people...
modernity is a Christian heresy. So and I quite agree that I pick up on every point Tom just made. The trouble is we Christians have come hat in hand to the secular culture, hoping to find their approval. That's getting it completely backwards. That's the integrated Orthodox view coming to a heretical position and saying, "Can you please take us seriously?" And we stopped taking ourselves seriously. And then we did what Kant and company recommended. Just turn Christianity into kind of a vague ethical system. But it's the very weirdness and distinctiveness and dense texture of Christianity that should be in the driver's seat culturally, it seems to me. My example of the principle that Tom was articulating, if I can I make reference to an American revolutionary? So when Jefferson blithely says in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Well, I mean, in the classical world, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, if you said, it's self-evident that all people are equal, what? I mean, it was the opposite of self-evident to them. Plato's whole political philosophy is predicated upon the assumption that we're not equal, and that the more we recognize that, the more just society we have. Aristotle thought that only a handful of people should get involved in politics. Most are incapable of it. The equality. So what happened? That's the interesting question. What happened to go from that to Jefferson, late 18th century, saying it's self-evident? Well, of course, the giveaway is that little word that all men are created equal. What intervened was the Christian sense of creation. And then, furthermore, from Jefferson, they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Well, nobody in the ancient world believed in inalienable rights for everybody. A handful of privileged people, or they were the gift of the state or something. But that everybody's got inalienable rights. Well, again, the giveaway, they're endowed by their creator with these. I mean, so there's the intervention of Christianity into the conversation. So things become self-evident to us because they've been hardwired through the Christian influence. We should claim that. And that's why I very much admire Tom Holland's work, because we should claim that as Christians confidently and boldly and stop coming hat in hand to the culture begging to be taken seriously. I think it should work the other way, you know.
I wonder, one of the things Tom mentioned, and I'll just give it to you, Bishop Barron, then give it back to Tom, was that his wife Sadie's baptism was the point at which her parents said, actually, I don't think we can believe any of this idea of original sin and so on. And that perhaps still is the stumbling block. It is the weirdness, because some things in Christianity do seem to jar with modern sensibilities. And of course, just this past week, the Church of England has been going through its own debates on sexuality and what modernization versus, historic biblical faith might look like in their scenario. So in the midst of all that happening, while we recognize that the church has been informed by the West has been informed by the church and tradition, how do we tell that story in an atmosphere where a lot of what the church perhaps is saying is no longer felt to be relevant or even welcome in the world?
Boldly and confidently. I mean, I think, like the doctrine of original sin, I'm with your countryman, G.K. Chesterton. It's the only doctrine for which there's clear empirical evidence, because, but properly right, that's Chesterton. Properly understood, I mean, original sin, it's the poisonous atmosphere in which we're all born, and we're inescapably affected by it. It's like, the best example to me is like a child whose mother's addicted to crack or something, and the child is born in complete innocence in one sense, but nevertheless addicted to this terrible drug and suffering from all the effects of it. Well, look at the Council of Trent, the wonderful statements on anthropology there. We're like members of a dysfunctional family. Someone that's born into a family that with alcohol abuse or physical abuse or sexual abuse, the child is born in one sense in complete innocence, but willy-nilly affected deeply by the dysfunction of the family into which he's born, right? Well, that's us, Again, Chester said, "What's the? We're all in the same boat, and we're all seasick, right?" But that's how we're born. And so, to me, the doctrine of original sin, it makes perfect sense, and it's programs of perfectibility. There's the problem, from Karl Marx on. People that say we can be perfected, God protect us from them, because then they'll come up with some social program that will affect this perfection. So no. I like the doctrine of original sin, and we should proclaim it from the rooftops.
What do you think of original sin, Tom?
We're all sinners, Dustin. We're all sinners. So, my wife was born in 1967, so I guess her baptism was, late 60s. And I think that the 60s will come to be seen by future historians as a decade as convulsive for what we might call Christendom as the 1520s were. And I think the repudiation of the doctrine of original sin was actually the single most dramatic kind of theological intervention of the 60s, because it came to be kind of paradigmatic of everything that the cutting edge of 60s culture was all about. It was the idea that if you only that people who affirmed the idea of original sin were blue meanies, and if you only got rid of them, then it would be non-stop Pepperland. There'd be Beatles music and psychedelic colors, and it'd all be groovy and hangout and free love and brilliant. And even as this doctrine was being propounded in the 60s, events of the late 60s were suggesting that perhaps there might be problems with this kind of hope. I think that we live in a Pelagian age now. So Pelagius, the great kind of opponent of Augustine, who became I guess Augustine is the figure who for Catholic and Protestant theologians alike stands behind them when they have talked about the doctrine of original sin. Augustine has been repudiated, it seems to me, since the 60s. Pelagius has been enshrined, even though lots of people wouldn't necessarily think of it in those terms. But I think to an extent, we live with the corollary of that, because actually the great thing about the doctrine of original sin, more than anything else, is that it's democratic. All of us share in it. And as the bishop suggested, the notion that perfectibility is possible is dangerous because it implies that if you don't become perfect, then it's your fault. And I think that the sense of those who are possessed by a desire to make the world better, which is the most admirable instinct and has been one that generations and generations of people in the Christian West have always had, that instinct is now combined with a sense of contempt for those who define themselves as virtuous tend to feel for those who have been left behind. And so I think that the paradox of those who are simultaneously radically anti-Christian, anti the doctrine of free sin, and who see themselves as virtuous, they are actually becoming the kind of parody of a malevolent Christian that they feel that they're opposing. Even the most, every Christian, even the most saintly, has to know that he or she is fallen, and therefore has to feel compassion with the sinner. But if you feel that someone can wash him or herself clean of sin, then you're entitled to feel contempt for the sinner. Why haven't they made themselves better? And that's where you start to get really, really vicious virtue spirals.
So you see that happening in some areas of culture where you're seeing certain types of ideology that almost say, now we know the truth, we are in the light, and everyone else has essentially...
I think contemporary culture seems like nothing but a kind of, a great spiraling of endless virtue.
Quick response
spirals.
to that, Bishop Barron, and then we'll go to some of these questions.
Well, the struggle between Pelagius and Augustine is one of the most titanic in the history of theology, and everything hinged upon it. If Pelagius had won, and indeed in many ways he has today, but if he had won, Christianity is over, because we're a salvation religion. If I can save myself, I don't need a savior. And then Jesus devolves into being a moral archetype of some kind. But why not Oprah? Why not anybody else could be a moral archetype? So if I can make myself better by, just putting my shoulder to the plow and so on, but if I'm broken in some fundamental way, again, like someone who's, let's say, born addicted to a drug, you can't say, I'm going to will my way out of this. No, you're fundamentally compromised in such a way that you need something from outside the broken system itself, right, to save you. Hence, by the way, everybody, why Jesus is both fully human and fully divine again. If he's simply human, okay, he's our brother and our friend and all those good things, but then he's as broken as we are. And he might be inspiring and he might be this and that, but he's not going to save us. If he's divine, he comes from outside the broken system in some very fundamental way, but enters into the broken system. Now look at the cross too. The one who can save us, entering in every possible sense into our brokenness, thereby to heal it. That's what the church fathers saw. That was key to Christianity. If you take, say, original sin, as we've been describing it, out of the equation, that whole thing falls apart. And you get the Jesus that we get today, which is our friend, our brother, our moral exemplar. Well, okay, then he's like, anybody else. He's like a Sufi mystic or like any other wisdom figure. But then the heck with him. Then there are 1,000 gurus out there I could follow. But if Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior, now we have Christianity. We have our problem that's so fundamental that we can't solve it has been solved by the one who can. So it much hinges on that Pelagius-Augustine debate.
We want to go to some questions that I'm sure there are lots of, and we'll only scratch the surface of. But perhaps we could have up on the screen. I know that the team have been busy putting together some of these so that we can see what some of our folk in the audience wanted to ask. Here we go. Tom, who is your favourite Roman emperor or general, and who is your favourite saint?
Oh, my favourite emperor by miles is Nero.
Interesting choice.
Awful, but I love him. He's by miles the most entertaining emperor.
Right.
So he... Okay, so there's the whole matricide thing,
yes,
but we'll draw a veil over that. He raced, he won gold at the Olympics racing chariot. He appeared on the stage. He played the lyre. And it's basically the equivalent, if I was emperor of the world, I would jig things so that I could win Formula One, headline at Glastonbury, win best actor Oscar every year. I mean, that's basically what he's doing. He's a tremendous lad, and
perhaps
I kind of love it.
The embodiment of that pre-Christian classical era.
Yes,
in that
sense. But because it's very charismatic. There's the whore of Babylon and all that kind of stuff. I mean,
favorite saints as well.
My favorite saint is Saint Cuthbert, the great Northumbrian saint, who would stand in his neck in the North Sea praying, and then he would come out onto the beach barefoot, and anyone who's come out of the sea barefoot, and in a Northumbrian beach there are a lot of pebbles, and then sea otters would come and warm his feet. And I love that sense of the engagement with the totality of creation that Cuthbert embodies, and the totality of his commitment to God. And I love the fact that of all the saints who came to be enshrined in the cathedrals of medieval Europe, his relics alone survived the Reformation. That Cromwell's men turned up in Durham Cathedral, demolished his shrine, dug up his body, and it was preserved. It's still intact. And they went, "Whoa, what are we going to do about this?" And so they laid it in a side annex and didn't really know what to do. And then they just reburied it. So Cuthbert's remains are still behind the high altar in Durham Cathedral. And as someone who feels very kind of, I love the Anglican tradition, the Protestant tradition that I was raised, but I'm also incredibly moved and inspired by the traditions of medieval Christianity in this country, and particularly I think the Anglo-Saxon saints, these titanic moral figures who first taught Christianity in what must have been an unbelievably harsh and hostile environment. Cuthbert seems to me the saint that best expresses that. And I also love the fact that he played his part in the Second World War. I've been told this by several Geordies, that when the Luftwaffe were heading towards Newcastle and Durham, people prayed to Cuthbert, and a fog came, and fog on the Tyne, and the Luftwaffe had to go back. Yeah. I don't know whether that story is true. I suspect it probably is.
It's a great
story
either way.
I love to think it. Yeah. And I think it shows Cuthbert struck down a Viking who disabused him, and for about 60 years he ruled the whole of the lands between the Tyne and the Tees, even though he was dead. And current political shenanigans makes me think that perhaps we should get him back on the job.
Cuthbert. Yeah.
I think he's great, and I think he should be England's national saint.
Great, wonderful. Maybe we'll go for another question and see what's being asked. If the world gets harsher and more unstable, and people lose confidence in the state and the market to provide hope, will the need for transcendent hope return? Perhaps you could start us off on this one, Bishop Barron.
Well, the transcendent hope is always there. It might be buried a bit, or it might be implicit rather than explicit. I think it's always there. I take page 1 of the Confessions as my marching orders in a way. Lord, you made us for yourself, and therefore our heart is restless till it rests in thee. And the fact that Augustine didn't put that in the plural, but the singular, right? Cor nostrum, meaning everybody's got this in common. We're all, Bruce Springsteen said it, right? Everyone's got a hungry heart. But everybody has a restless heart, the heart that's ordered to God. So the hope is always there for the transcendent, but we have to awaken it. We have to appeal to it. There's, again, the danger of the buffered self that's denying the longing of the heart. That's the trouble with secularism as an ideology, that convinces people you can be satisfied by enough wealth, power, pleasure, and honor, the 4 great substitutes. And the churches have always been there to say, no, Those things are fine, but they're creatures. That's what the Hebrew prophets said too. Don't hook the infinite desire for God onto something finite. It'll make you crazy and addicted. Look at the story of the priests of Baal. To me, is so telling there. They're calling upon their gods, and they're hopping around the altars and then wounding themselves. Remember, until they bleed. That to me is a beautiful metaphor of what happens when you hook the desire for God onto a false god. Is you become crazy and then addicted to it. And Elijah calling upon Yahweh and the fire comes. It's not just, isn't that great? My God's bigger than your God. It's making that spiritual point that only the true God will answer the longing of the heart. And secularism is a kind of hopping around the altars of the priests of Baal all the time. And I think you can see it on clear display in the society that people are becoming deeply addicted to all these things. And we've got to be there with a word of salvation and liberation, Can I say, too, I love the Durham Cathedral. I've been there twice. Anyone from Southwark here? When I came to Leeds many years ago, I was invited to give talks by, at the time, Bishop Arthur Roach, who's now a cardinal in Rome, right? And he invited me, and I was picked up at the airport, Manchester, by John Wilson, the current Archbishop of Southwark. And he picked me up, and we're going, I said, how far is it to Durham from here? And I forget what he said, but it wasn't all that far. And I said, can you take me there? I want to see the Durham Cathedral. So that was the first stop we made.
Wow.
And I've always loved that cathedral.
Wonderful, wonderful. Tom, anything to add on this sense of, with the current political and social atmosphere out there, are people looking for something more?
I think people always do in times of plague and war and kind of dread. And simply as a statement of historical fact, Christianity has proven itself to be the most successful attempt devised by humanity to explain why humanity is here and why there is hope in a world that might seem oppressed by horror. It is not, it is, the Marxist take on that is that it's an opiate, that it numbs and dulls people. But I would say that perhaps Christianity can only most fully, it's the potential of its explanations and its dramas and its narratives. Perhaps it takes difficult times fully to kind of accentuate what it has to offer, perhaps. It's kind of like, a sculpture that's in darkness or shadow, and difficult times kind of sharpens the light so that you can see it more clearly. Because Christianity emerged in a time, in times of plague, and it survived the implosion of the Roman peace and flourished amid violence and horror. And so, but I'm reluctant to say, well, what the revival of Christianity needs is a really good war. No, it's...
I appreciate that, and who knows what the future may hold, but I guess from your point of view, God in his grace uses all kinds of means, be they good or evil, to bring about his ultimate purpose.
Yeah, the church has been around from ancient empires through medieval monarchies into modern nation states, through totalitarian systems up to the present day, sometimes flourishing, sometimes under fierce persecution. No need to remind you of that. It happened here for a long time. That to me is a rather amazing fact in itself. Just the simple endurance of the church across the ages. Tom Holland can tell that story in much more detail than I can, but the very fact that we're still here matters to me enormously. If anyone's seen the Catholicism series I did years ago, I reflected on Cardinal George's experience. I mentioned him earlier when they elected Pope Benedict, and they came up on the balcony of St. Peter's there, and he had this very pensive look on his face, and the camera came in on him, and people asked him when he got home, "What were you thinking about?" And Cardinal George, who had a keen sense of history, said, well, I was kind of gazing out toward the Palatine Hill, and I was wondering, where are Caesar's successors? They're long gone, but Peter's successor is right there, and he's smiling and waving at the crowds. And there's something deeply weird about that, you know? Now, Caesar has indirect successors, of course, but I mean, the Roman Empire, it's long gone, but yet the Church of Jesus that Peter and Paul and company brought to Rome, it's still alive and kicking, and that's interesting.
I remember during the pandemic, one of the moments that still absolutely resonates with me was the Pope conducted a service in St. Peter's Square. I can't remember exactly what it was. It was quite early in the it was early in the pandemic, and he was doing it, socially distanced, so there was no one else really with him in St. Peter's Square. And as he performed the service, you could hear the clanging of bells and the wailing of sirens from all the ambulances taking people to hospital in the background. And then he went and prayed before an icon of the Virgin and the infant Christ that, according to tradition, had been sent from Constantinople to Gregory I, Gregory the Great, the Pope who sent missionaries to Britain. And Gregory had become Pope in a time of plague. So the Castel Sant'Angelo, the great statue of St. Michael sheathing his sword, alludes to a legend that dates back to the time of Gregory the Great, the plague arrows were raining down, and Gregory led a procession through the streets of Rome offering up prayer, and St. Michael appeared on the tomb of Hadrian, as it was, and sheathed his sword. And this is what's shown in the famous statue of St. Michael on the Castel Sant'Angelo. But the further kind of distance is that Gregory the Great wrote a commentary on the book of Job. And Job is, it's possibly the greatest text ever written on the great imponderable question of how an all-good God can allow bad things to happen, basically. And that sense of the fact that what we were going through in 2020 was something that people back in the 6th century had gone through and wrestled with, and that they in turn were looking back to whenever the book of Job was written, and the feeling that we had this immense resource of writings and examples and communion with generations and generations and generations of people who had gone through what we were going through during the pandemic, I found unbelievably powerful. And that is something that I suppose Christianity offers perhaps as powerfully as any tradition that's ever been.
Thank you. Well, we've time. Yes, please do. I think that's very powerful. We've time, I think, for one more question, and this probably is going to be our summary of our conversation today. Tom and Bishop Barron, what is the role of the church in society today, and what can it be? So just a small one to finish with, but I'll start with you, Tom, and then Bishop Barron. What's the role of the church then?
Well, the church, what do we mean by the church? I guess it's a Catholic conference, so you'll all have a
view on what that is.
But there are many churches. Are they all one church? I guess. But I think the problem for all the churches is precisely the fact that we are living through what is a great new convulsion of reformatio, a remaking, a remolding of society and the way that people within it understand it. I think that what is animating people on the cutting edge of this derives from Christianity, but I think that without the framework of familiarity with Scripture, familiarity with doctrines, with church, the simple functioning of the church, I think that that inheritance of Christianity is starting to mutate in often to Christianize quite strange ways. And I don't know where that will lead. I also can't remember what the question was.
Well, it was lolling off
in all kinds of directions. What was the question?
Well, what should the role, I think, was
right.
The question.
So I think the role of the church for Christians should be to define themselves very, very clearly against this process.
Okay.
Because what is happening is the cannibalization of the historical inheritance of the church. And if the church isn't careful, then it will be cannibalized as well.
Okay, that's really helpful. Bishop Barron.
I wonder if I could rehearse something I did at Parliament on Monday night. I mentioned Dorothy Day earlier, right? Well, her co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement was a guy named Peter Morin. And Peter Morin said, we've taken the dynamite of the church, we put it in hermetically sealed containers and have sat on the lid. It's time to blow up the dynamite of the church, right? Well, I'm telling that story and I caught myself and I said, okay, wait a minute, I'm a Catholic bishop in Parliament talking about blowing up dynamite. I said it might not be the right time and place for that metaphor. But of course, what Peter Morin, who was a great advocate of nonviolence, what he meant, dunamis, right? Power in the Greek, that there's a power in the gospel. And now he's writing that back in the 1930s, that we've taken the power of the gospel and we've kind of covered it up and we've domesticated it somehow. Well, the other thing I did at the Parliament, I began the talk by talking about this young Hindu law student who comes to London, 1888. And at first he's so shy, he won't even leave his room. He's so afraid of speaking English. It's Gandhi, of course. And eventually Gandhi falls in with a group of Christians who challenged him to read the Bible. And like most first-time readers of the Bible, the Old Testament was pretty opaque to him. But he read the New Testament, this young, very curious Indian law student. And it was chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Matthew that electrified him. He read the Sermon on the Mount and said, yeah, the love of enemies and nonviolence and turn the other cheek, construed not as passivity, but as a real way of engaging evil in a creative, loving way. All that. And he ran to his Christian friends and he said, I found this most extraordinary thing in your book. And they all said, well, no one really takes that too seriously. That's nice ideals, but we don't really follow that. But by God, he did. He goes back to his native country eventually with the message of the gospel, and then used it to enormous, effect. And I found wonderful, then he's imitated by people like Martin Luther King in my country. How beautiful, by the way, when I was strolling around this central area of London when I first arrived, and there was a statue of Gandhi, and I thought of that young law student, coming here. And then right across on the facade of the Abbey is Martin Luther King. Well, King, the Christian preacher, but he is inspired by Gandhi, who got it from Matthew 5. See, but that's the dynamite of the church. That's it. Because the nonviolence Jesus is talking about is reflective of the nonviolent God who made the universe not through violence, but through an act of love and all of that. The nonviolence of the cross, right? And then what's hovering above the whole Parliament, I said, was the Union Jack, which is 3 crosses. So you have the cross on which this young Jewish rabbi is put to death 2,000 years ago, weirdly hangs over the whole of the civic life of this country. Well, that's worth thinking about. That's part of the dynamite of the church. And I think that's the role of the church, is to keep proclaiming it in season and out. When they're throwing flowers at us and when they're killing us, we should keep announcing that message.
What a privilege it's been to sit down with you both. I apologise we didn't have time for more questions, but I hope that you'll go and listen to The Rest is History, Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook's podcast. Read Dominion. It's an amazing book. And obviously watch Word on Fire in all its various incarnations. But for now, would you...